Clara stood still for a moment, her gaze drifting over the snow-covered landscape of Central Park. The world around her seemed to pause, holding its breath, as if recognizing the profound change within her. The cold air had a gentle bite to it, but she didn't feel it. She felt nothing but a quiet, peaceful warmth, a warmth that had been kindled deep within her soul. The nightmare she had faced was no longer a shadow in her mind. It had been woven into the fabric of her story and, in doing so, had lost its power. It no longer haunted her. Instead, it had become a part of the journey, something that had brought her to this moment of peace. The Nutcracker, once a terrifying figure in the darkness, was just a memory now, a toy discarded on the stage, its magic undone. And Clara, the girl who had once trembled in its presence, had grown into a woman who now embraced the quiet strength within her. With a final glance at the falling snow, Clara took a slow step forward, her feet crunching lightly on the fresh snow beneath her. Each step felt like a soft affirmation of the future, a future she now felt ready to embrace fully. There were still challenges ahead, of course. Life was never without its trials. But for the first time, Clara felt confident that she could face them. The darkness was behind her, and the light of possibilities stretched out before her. As she continued her walk through the park, the city around her seemed to pulse with new energy, its streets full of people living their lives, unaware of the quiet triumph she had just experienced. But it didn't matter. What mattered was that Clara knew she had reclaimed her own life, her own story. And with that knowledge, she walked on, her heart light, her spirit free. The future awaited her, open and full of promise, and Clara was no longer afraid. For she had learned the most important lesson of all. The magic was always within her, and no nightmare, no matter how dark, could ever take that away. Her name was being chanted in soft, lilting voices, like a lullaby sung in a forgotten tongue. Clara looked around, but the theater was empty. Not a soul was in sight. And yet, the sound of footsteps echoed in rhythm with hers, matching her every move. Her heartbeat quickened. She glanced up at the stage, and there it was, a single, lit Nutcracker figure standing at the center. Its wooden face was painted with a stern expression, but its eyes, those eyes, were different from the others she had seen earlier. They glowed, faintly, but with an unnatural intensity that seemed to bore right into her soul. The Nutcracker's mouth opened ever so slightly, as if to speak. "Come closer," it whispered, though its lips never moved. Clara's breath caught in her throat. The air felt thick, oppressive, as though she were walking through a dream she couldn't escape. Her legs moved forward, almost on their own, toward the stage. Each step seemed to draw her deeper into the spell that the theater had cast over her. The Nutcracker's eyes flickered, a subtle glimmer of movement, and in that moment, Clara knew she was no longer just a spectator. She was part of the performance. Her feet stopped at the edge of the stage, where the velvet curtains swayed gently, though there was no breeze. The room around her seemed to pulse with energy, the music growing louder, more intense. The Nutcracker's gaze never left her, and now she could hear his voice clearly, echoing in her mind. "Welcome, Clara. You've been expected." Her skin prickled with fear. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. But before she could turn to flee, the lights in the theater flickered once more, and everything around her began to shift. The walls stretched, the floor tilted, and the space seemed to warp into something far darker and more ancient. The Nutcracker figure stepped down from the stage, its wooden limbs creaking with each movement. The music slowed to a haunting lull, and the air grew colder still, as though the very essence of winter had invaded this dreamlike place. Clara's breath came in shallow gasps as she stood frozen, the weight of her fear holding her in place. "Join us, Clara," the voice whispered again. "You're the final piece of the puzzle." But before she could ask what it meant, a chill ran through her that made her legs feel like stone. The Nutcracker's eyes locked onto hers with an intensity that made her blood run cold. And then, just as suddenly, the world around her went silent. The music stopped. The lights went out. And Clara was left standing in complete darkness. The silence was deafening, thick and suffocating. Clara's pulse thundered in her ears, and her breath came in ragged gasps as she stood alone in the pitch-black theater. Her heart raced, each beat heavy with a fear she had never known. She reached out with trembling hands, but there was nothing, no walls, no stage, nothing but a void. The sensation of cold seeped deeper into her skin, chilling her to the bone, and the air grew denser with every passing second. Then, without warning, a soft glow began to emerge in the distance. It flickered like a candlelight, dim at first, but it grew stronger, casting long, twisting shadows that stretched across the floor. Clara's breath caught in her throat. She slowly turned toward the light, her body frozen in place, but her curiosity pushing her forward. With each step she took, the shadows shifted, and the air seemed to hum with a low, eerie vibration. The light grew brighter, revealing a tall figure cloaked in deep red robes, standing just ahead. The figure's face was obscured by a hood, but Clara could feel its gaze, heavy and unyielding upon her. "Clara," the voice whispered, a soft rasp that filled the darkened space. It was a voice she recognized, yet it was twisted, somehow distorted, as if it had been pulled from some forgotten memory. "Do not be afraid," it continued, but the words felt hollow, like a lie that could not be hidden. Clara wanted to run, wanted to escape the overwhelming sensation of wrongness that filled the air, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She could only stand there, paralyzed by the figure's presence. The hooded figure stepped closer, its movement slow but deliberate. The dim light from its body cast strange shadows on the walls, twisting the shapes around her. Clara's breath caught as she finally caught a glimpse of the figure's hands. They were long and slender, their fingers unnaturally elongated, and they seemed to shimmer with an eerie, cold glow. "Do you know why you are here, Clara?" the voice asked again. Clara shook her head, her mouth dry. I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the suffocating silence. The figure's lips barely moved, but its words were clear. "You're part of a story," it said. "A story that never truly ends." Clara's stomach twisted in unease. A story? She thought of the Nutcracker, the strange whispers, the eerie theater. Nothing made sense. The figure moved even closer now, its presence overwhelming, as though it filled the very space around her. "You must complete your role," it intoned, its voice deepening, the words seeming to resonate within Clara's chest. "Or the story will never let you go." Clara wanted to scream, to break free, but her voice was stuck in her throat. The figure raised one long, gloved finger, pointing toward the empty stage. It beckoned her, the darkness around her swirling as if it were alive, a hungry force that pulled at her very being. "Come, Clara. The Nutcracker waits." Without thinking, without a second's hesitation, her legs moved of their own accord. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was trying to hold her back. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the air itself was trying to hold her back. But she couldn't stop. The figure's voice was all-encompassing now, wrapping itself around her like chains. "Complete your role." The words echoed in her mind as she crossed the threshold of the stage. And as she stepped into the soft, velvet glow of the spotlight, she could see it, the Nutcracker, standing tall and waiting. Its wooden eyes glowed brightly, its expression more intense than ever. Clara's heart sank. She realized then, with a terrible clarity, that she had become part of something far darker than a simple holiday dream. The figure's voice was all-encompassing now, wrapping itself around her like chains. "Complete your role." The words echoed in her mind as she crossed the threshold of the stage. And as she stepped into the soft, velvet glow of the spotlight, she could see it, the Nutcracker, standing tall and waiting. Its wooden eyes glowed brightly, its expression more intense than ever. Clara's heart sank. She realized then, with a terrible clarity, that she had become part of something far darker than a simple holiday dream. And now there was no turning back. The Nutcracker's gaze locked onto Clara, and she felt her breath catch in her throat. Its eyes, those glowing, haunting eyes, seemed to pierce into her very soul, stripping away her thoughts, her fears, her sense of self. For a moment, she stood frozen, unable to move, unable to look away. The theater around her seemed to blur, the walls shifting and warping as if the entire space were alive, watching her. The Nutcracker's painted lips curled into a faint, sinister smile, and Clara's heart raced. She wanted to run, to escape the nightmarish scene unfolding before her, but her body refused to obey. "Clara," the voice from behind her whispered, pulling her back into the darkness of the shadows. She could feel the figure's presence looming over her, like a weight pressing on her chest. The music, which had been quiet until now, swelled to a thunderous crescendo, rattling the very air around her. It was no longer a sweet lullaby, it was deep and foreboding, filled with a sense of dread that twisted through every note. The Nutcracker's wooden joints creaked as it began to move, slowly at first, its limbs jerking into motion like the turning of an ancient clock. Clara's eyes widened. She had never seen a toy move so unnaturally, as if it were being controlled by a force beyond human understanding. It took a step forward, its heavy boots thudding against the stage, echoing through the theater like a drumbeat of doom. With each step, Clara's heart beat faster, her limbs growing more heavy, as if she were sinking deeper into some impossible abyss. The Nutcracker raised its arms, holding them out as though welcoming her. "Join me," it said, its voice now low and hollow, almost like the wind whistling through an empty room. The words felt like a command, an unspoken decree that Clara could not refuse. Though every fiber of her being screamed in protest, she felt herself taking one slow step toward it. The velvet curtains fluttered behind her, casting strange, flickering shadows as though the very fabric of reality were tearing apart. Clara reached out her hand, her fingers trembling, not knowing if she was offering it to the Nutcracker or if it was pulling her in. Her skin brushed against the cold wood of its outstretched hand, and in that instant, the world seemed to shudder. A shock of icy cold surged through her arm, spreading down to her fingertips and up to her chest. The Nutcracker's grip tightened, its wooden fingers pressing into her skin like steel. Clara gasped, her body frozen in place, as an icy chill swept through her entire being. The Nutcracker's eyes flared brighter, and suddenly, Clara felt herself being pulled into a vortex of shadow. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the ground beneath her seemed to twist and warp. The walls of the theater stretched impossibly wide, the ceilings rising and falling in a sickening rhythm, like the pulse of some ancient creature. Clara's breath grew shallow, and the edges of her vision blurred. She could feel herself being drawn deeper into the heart of the darkness, where no light reached, where the whispers from before seemed to echo louder, almost deafening. "Clara," the voice from behind her whispered again, this time more insistent, more demanding. "Come home, Clara." Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs, and she could barely hold on to her thoughts. Home. The word felt like an insult, like a mockery of everything she once knew. But before she could even comprehend what was happening, she found herself standing before the Nutcracker once more, this time no longer a figure made of wood. It had become something else, something darker. Its form twisted and changed before her, the wooden joints melding into something more fluid, more sinister. The once vibrant colors of its costume drained away, leaving it in shadows of deep crimson and black. Clara's breath caught in her throat as the Nutcracker now towered over her, no longer a toy, but a creature of nightmares, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. And with that, Clara realized the horrible truth. The Nutcracker had been waiting for her all along, not for a performance, but for something far more terrifying. And she had unknowingly become part of its twisted story. Clara's knees buckled beneath her as the towering figure of the Nutcracker loomed above her, its presence suffocating. She tried to step back, to escape the weight of its gaze, but her body refused to move. Her mind screamed for release, but her limbs were heavy, as though the very air around her had solidified, trapping her in place. The Nutcracker's twisted form shimmered in the dim light, its once bright colors now drained, replaced by shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living tendrils. Its eyes burned, glowing with an unnatural intensity, and Clara felt the weight of its stare pressing into her chest. "Clara," the voice echoed again, no longer a soft whisper but a deep, resonant growl. She trembled, feeling every nerve in her body light up with terror. The air around her grew colder still, an icy chill creeping up her spine, sending waves of discomfort through every bone. She wanted to scream, to run, but her mouth was dry, her voice lost in the overwhelming silence. The Nutcracker's mouth opened, not with the delicate smile it had worn before, but in a wide, grotesque grin, revealing jagged, sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. It reached out with one long, skeletal hand, its fingers curling and uncurling like claws. Clara's heartbeat quickened, and she felt a sudden surge of fear unlike anything she had ever known. "Do you see now, Clara?" The Nutcracker's voice rumbled, each word dripping with malice. "You were never meant to leave this place." A sickening chill spread through her as the Nutcracker's grip tightened around her arm. The coldness of its touch seeped deep into her skin, its icy fingers crawling through her veins, freezing her very soul. "Stop." Clara finally managed to cry out, her voice a hoarse whisper. But the Nutcracker's grin only widened, the shadows around it deepening. "You cannot escape," it whispered, its voice like a dark lullaby. Clara's mind raced, searching for any way out of this nightmare. She closed her eyes, willing herself to wake up, to snap out of the horrifying dream. But when she opened them again, the world hadn't changed. The walls of the theater were closing in, and the figure of the Nutcracker stood taller and taller, pressing her deeper into the darkness. Her breath came in shallow gasps as panic gripped her heart. She tried to shake the coldness away, but it clung to her, wrapping around her like a vice. "Clara." The voice came again, now not from the Nutcracker, but from all around her. The shadows whispered her name, as if the very theater had come alive, feeding on her fear. "Clara." The whispers swirled, growing louder, becoming a cacophony of voices that filled her ears, drowning her in their endless calls. The ground beneath her shifted, warping, as if it were no longer solid. The velvet curtains around her seemed to close in, their rich red fabric twisting into dark, suffocating shapes. And in the center of it all stood the Nutcracker, no longer just a figure, but something monstrous, a creature born of nightmares. Clara's vision blurred, her breath quickening, as the world seemed to twist and churn around her. She was trapped. Trapped in a nightmare that had no end. And as the Nutcracker's cold, skeletal hand reached for her again, Clara realized the terrible truth. This wasn't just a dream. It was a curse. A curse she had unknowingly stepped into, and now there was no way out. The Nutcracker's skeletal hand reached closer, its fingers curling with an unnatural grace, each joint creaking and snapping like the brittle bones of some ancient, forgotten creature. Clara's heart hammered in her chest, each beat deafening in the oppressive silence that surrounded her. She tried to pull away, but the cold, the suffocating chill of the Nutcracker's grasp held her firm. Her breath came in shallow, desperate gasps as the darkness of the theater seemed to close in tighter around her. The whispers intensified, growing louder, becoming an overwhelming chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all chanting her name. Clara, Clara, Clara. The walls of the theater seemed to pulse, vibrating with the power of those voices, as if the building itself were alive, feeding off her fear. The Nutcracker's eyes burned brighter, its gaze more intense than ever before. It tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, before its lips parted into that horrifying grin, the jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "Do you feel it, Clara?" The Nutcracker's voice growled, now deeper and more resonant, as if it came from somewhere far darker. "The darkness is not just in this place. It's within you. It always has been." Clara's mind screamed, her thoughts a chaotic blur as the weight of the words hit her like a physical blow. What did it mean? Had she somehow become part of this twisted story? Was there something within her that had led her here? Her skin crawled with the realization that the Nutcracker wasn't just a toy, a figment of a holiday dream. It was something ancient, something evil, and it had been waiting for her all along. "Let go, Clara," the voice hummed again, now echoing from all around her, from the shadows themselves. It was not just the Nutcracker speaking. The theater, the very essence of this place, had come alive, wrapping its cold, malicious tendrils around her. With all her might, Clara fought back. Her body, frozen in terror just moments ago, surged with the adrenaline of survival. Her arm, still trapped in the icy grip of the Nutcracker, burned with the cold that seeped deeper with each passing second. But then, in a sudden burst of energy, Clara jerked her arm free. For a split second, she felt the release, a fleeting moment of freedom, before the world around her began to warp again. The shadows flickered, shifting like liquid, and the ground seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Clara stumbled, trying to regain her balance, but the darkness was closing in. The Nutcracker let out a low, chilling laugh as its eyes glowed brighter, now filled with something far darker than malice. Clara's head spun, her surroundings spinning faster and faster, until she could no longer tell up from down. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything went still. The world stopped moving. The music, the whispers, the flickering shadows, all of it stopped. For a moment, Clara thought she might be free, that she had somehow escaped the nightmare. But when she opened her eyes again, she was no longer in the Grand Theater. Instead, she stood in the heart of a dark, snow-covered forest. The trees loomed above her, their skeletal branches twisting and reaching like long, grasping fingers. The air was frigid, colder than any winter night she had ever experienced. The snow beneath her feet crunched with every step, but there was no sound, only an oppressive silence. And there, in the distance, standing alone in the center of the forest, was the Nutcracker. Its eyes still glowed, brighter now than ever before. Clara's heart sank. This nightmare wasn't over. It had only just begun. Clara's feet felt heavy as she stood in the middle of the desolate, snow-covered forest, her breath coming in sharp, visible gasps. The cold air pierced through her clothes, biting into her skin like icy needles. She could see the Nutcracker standing just ahead, its wooden form now taller, more menacing, as if it had grown with the darkness around them. Its glowing eyes never left her, and with every step she took toward it, the air grew colder, denser, the silence more profound. The snow underfoot was thick and untouched, but it felt wrong, unnatural, as if it had been here for centuries, frozen in time. The Nutcracker did not move. It stood there, unmoving, a sentinel in the middle of the forest, waiting for her. Clara's heart raced in her chest, her feet unwilling to move any closer. But something deep inside her stirred, something ancient, something that had always been a part of her. She couldn't explain it, but the urge to go forward, to confront the Nutcracker, grew stronger with each passing second. It was as though she had no choice in the matter. Her body seemed to obey an unseen command as she started to move toward it, each step pulling her deeper into the heart of the darkness. The forest around her seemed to stretch on forever, the trees closing in like walls, their bare branches reaching for her like clawed hands. A cold wind swept through the trees, rustling the frozen branches, but the Nutcracker remained still, its wooden body as rigid as ever. As Clara neared it, she could feel the pull of its gaze. It was like a gravitational force, a strange and terrible magnetism drawing her closer to it. And then, just as her hand reached out toward it, the world around her shifted once more. The trees began to blur, the forest warping into something more sinister. The snow, once so pristine, turned black and foul, swirling around her feet like thick, viscous oil. The Nutcracker's glowing eyes flickered, dimming, and for a moment, the world fell silent again. But then, the ground beneath Clara's feet began to tremble. A low rumble, deep and unsettling, vibrated through the air, and she felt her body stiffen with dread. Suddenly, the Nutcracker's voice broke through the silence, its tone darker than before. "Clara, this is the end," it intoned, its voice deep and resonant, echoing through the twisted forest. Clara froze. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest as the words echoed around her. She could feel the weight of them, pressing down on her like a heavy stone. "This isn't just a place," the Nutcracker continued, its voice now a low growl. "This is your world now, and you will never leave." Clara's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the chill crawling deeper into her skin, invading her thoughts, her very soul. She turned to run, but the forest seemed to close in around her. The trees twisted and contorted, their branches locking together like iron bars. Every path she took led her back to the Nutcracker, its glowing eyes ever watchful. "Clara," it whispered almost lovingly, "the story is not over. It is yours now." Panic surged through her, and she desperately clawed at the snow, at the trees, at the very air around her, trying to break free. But it was futile. She was trapped in this nightmare, locked in this world that seemed to stretch on forever. The Nutcracker moved then, its wooden limbs creaking as it slowly stepped forward, its jagged smile growing wider. "Do you see, Clara? You are part of the curse now, part of the story, and there is no escape." Clara screamed, a raw, terrified sound, but the world around her swallowed it whole. The forest, the Nutcracker, the nightmarish reality, they were all closing in, and no matter how hard she fought, she couldn't break free. The snow beneath her feet swirled into dark shadows, and the air turned to ice, trapping her in the heart of a world that had no end, no escape. And as the Nutcracker stepped closer, Clara realized the full weight of the truth. The Nutcracker's world wasn't a place, it was a prison. And now she was its prisoner forever. Clara's pulse raced as she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet once more, a deep, unrelenting rumble vibrating through the blackened snow. She stumbled backward, her hands outstretched, trying to push away the ever-encroaching darkness, but the air grew thicker, heavier with each breath she took. The Nutcracker's presence loomed over her, its eyes glowing with an eerie, cold fire burning into her soul. Her legs felt as if they were filled with lead, and her mind screamed for release, but the forest, the curse, had her in its unyielding grip. Every movement she made was slow, sluggish, as though the very world around her was resisting her every action. The trees seemed to stretch taller, their gnarled branches reaching down like claws, creating an inescapable barrier. With each step she took, the snow grew deeper, the shadows longer. And then, as if sensing her desperation, the Nutcracker spoke again, its voice cold and cruel. "You're mine now, Clara." The words cut through the thick silence like a knife, sending a shockwave of fear rippling through her chest. She opened her mouth to scream, but the sound never came. The air around her was too dense, too suffocating. The Nutcracker's grin spread wider, impossibly wide, its jagged teeth gleaming in the dim, shadowed light. "You think you can escape this place?" This story. Clara trembled, her body trembling with the force of the terror surging through her. But deep within, there was a spark, something small, fragile, but burning with determination. The Nutcracker's presence pressed in on her, but Clara clung to that spark, refusing to let it go. She had to fight. She had to find a way out. The shadows that enveloped her seemed to pulse in rhythm with her heartbeat, as if the very darkness had become her enemy. With a sharp breath, Clara took a step forward, her body heavy and slow, but her mind focused. Each step felt like an eternity, the weight of the forest pressing on her shoulders, but she refused to stop. The Nutcracker's hollow laugh echoed through the trees, sending shivers down her spine. "Don't you see, Clara? There is no escape." She refused to listen. Her legs moved faster now, the snow cracking beneath her feet as she surged forward. But just as she thought she might break through, she saw it, a figure in the distance, standing between her and the way forward. A silhouette tall and unmistakable. The figure's shape was distorted, bent in an unnatural way, a dark shadow that loomed menacingly in the distance. Clara's heart skipped a beat. It was a mirror image of the Nutcracker, but twisted and grotesque, its wooden body splintered, its eyes hollow, its mouth a gaping void. The figure's arms stretched outward, as if welcoming her to the abyss. "Clara," it whispered in a voice that was both familiar and foreign. "It is time." The words echoed through Clara's mind, twisting her thoughts, suffocating her. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat a frantic plea for freedom. But no matter how hard she tried, no matter how far she ran, the forest would not let her go. It was as though she was caught in a never-ending cycle. No matter how much she struggled, she always returned to the same place. Back to the same nightmare. The Nutcracker's figure in the distance began to shift, its body contorting, becoming larger, more menacing, its eyes burning brighter, its mouth stretching wider. "Clara." It called again, its voice growing louder. "You cannot escape. Not from me. Not from this world." Clara's legs trembled as she stumbled, falling to her knees in the blackened snow. The darkness around her surged forward, swallowing her whole. But in that moment, in the midst of the overwhelming terror, she realized something. The Nutcracker was not just a figure of nightmares, it was a reflection of the darkness inside her. The curse, the forest, the unrelenting fear, it was all a part of her own journey. And maybe, just maybe, she could rewrite the ending. With trembling hands, Clara pushed herself back to her feet. She was trapped, yes, but she still had one thing left, her will to fight. She could fight. She could end this. And so, with newfound strength, Clara stepped forward into the looming darkness. This was her story, and she would be the one to end it. Clara's breath came in short, frantic bursts as she faced the looming darkness, her heart pounding fiercely in her chest. The Nutcracker's twisted, distorted figure stood ahead, its eyes glowing brighter with each step she took forward. Every movement felt like a battle, but Clara could no longer afford to hesitate. This was her nightmare, her story, and it was time to reclaim it. Her legs felt like lead, but she pushed through, feeling the icy grip of fear claw at her mind, urging her to stop, to turn back. But she refused. She had to move forward. The forest around her seemed to shift again, the trees stretching farther apart, their skeletal branches reaching toward her with long, grasping fingers. The snow beneath her feet no longer crunched, but squelched as if the earth itself were alive, moving with the rhythm of her steps. The Nutcracker's eyes followed her every move, the eerie glow of its gaze growing with each passing second. "Clara," its voice boomed again, this time reverberating through the entire forest, shaking the ground beneath her. She faltered for a moment, but then the spark of determination burned brighter inside her, and she pressed on. The Nutcracker's laugh echoed behind her, cold and mocking, but Clara did not stop. She could feel the pull of the darkness around her, the weight of the curse that bound her to this world. But she refused to be a prisoner any longer. The snow around her began to swirl, the wind picking up, howling through the trees like a pack of wolves. The Nutcracker's twisted form towered above her now, the gleaming teeth of its smile impossibly wide, its wooden frame groaning and creaking as if it were alive. "Clara," the voice hissed, "you think you can escape?" With one final push, Clara closed the distance between them. Her hand trembled as she reached toward the Nutcracker, not in fear, but in defiance. "I will escape," she whispered fiercely, her voice shaking but resolute. The Nutcracker's eyes widened, its grin faltering as the world around them trembled. For the first time, Clara felt something shift, like a door, once tightly shut, had cracked open just enough for light to seep through. The darkness seemed to recoil at her defiance, and for a split second, the world around her blurred. The trees shook, the snow flew upwards in an unnatural wind, and Clara felt a strange warmth spread from her chest, as if her inner light was finally pushing back the shadow. She focused on that light, the part of her that had been buried deep within her all along. Her power. The Nutcracker's laughter faltered. The twisted smile began to fade, its sharp teeth retreating back into the wooden mouth. "No," the Nutcracker growled, its voice crackling, breaking apart like shattered wood. "You can't." Clara held her ground, her hand reaching out as the world around her began to distort and unravel. With each heartbeat, the light inside her grew stronger, pushing the darkness back inch by inch, tearing at the cursed world that had held her prisoner for so long. The snow began to melt, the trees seemed to tremble and retreat, and the Nutcracker's form began to crack and splinter, its wooden exterior unraveling like a forgotten toy. "I'm not afraid anymore," Clara whispered, the words coming from deep within her. And in that moment, everything shattered. The forest, the snow, the Nutcracker, it all crumbled, dissolving into the air as if it had never existed. Clara gasped, blinking in the sudden change. She found herself standing once more in the warmth of the theater, the grand hall around her bathed in soft golden light. The Nutcracker, no longer a twisted monster, was just a mere puppet once again, resting in the corner of the stage as if nothing had ever happened. Clara looked around, her breath slow and steady now, the weight of fear finally lifting from her shoulders. She had done it. She had broken the curse. And as the first light of dawn peeked through the windows, Clara knew this was just the beginning. The Nutcracker's world might have been a nightmare, but it was hers to face, and now she had the power to change it. Clara stood in the grand theater, the echoes of the Nutcracker's twisted world still reverberating in her mind. The soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the large, ornate windows, casting a warm, golden light across the stage. Everything seemed calm, almost dreamlike, but Clara's heart was still racing, the remnants of fear lingering in her chest. The Nutcracker lay there, perfectly still in the corner, its wooden body unremarkable once again, just a simple, delicate toy. But Clara knew that something had changed. She had faced the nightmare, stared down the darkness that had threatened to consume her, and now she stood victorious. For a moment, she allowed herself to simply breathe, to take in the quiet of the theater, the stillness that surrounded her. But as she turned to leave, the slightest movement caught her eye, a flicker of movement on the stage. Clara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. The Nutcracker shifted, just a tiny motion at first, like a breath escaping from deep within its wooden chest. Her breath hitched as she watched, captivated and wary. Then it moved again, slowly, deliberately, as though testing the air. Clara's pulse quickened. Was it possible? Could the nightmare have come back? The Nutcracker's eyes glowed faintly, just a soft ember of light, but it was enough to send a shiver down Clara's spine. She stepped back cautiously, her hand instinctively reaching for the edge of the stage. For a moment, nothing happened. But then, in a sudden burst, the Nutcracker sprang to life, its wooden limbs jerking and creaking, snapping into motion as if it had been waiting for this moment. Clara gasped, her eyes widening in shock. The toy, which had seemed so benign just moments ago, was now alive with dark energy, its grin widening impossibly, its wooden joints grinding with every movement. It moved toward her, the sharp, scraping sound of its limbs echoing in the once peaceful silence. "No," Clara whispered, stepping back, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. The Nutcracker's eyes locked onto her, the faint glow intensifying as its body twisted, like a marionette with strings pulled by an unseen hand. The cold, eerie laugh from earlier echoed in the theater again, sending a chill through Clara's body. "You thought you had defeated me," the Nutcracker's voice hissed, now more distorted and mocking than before. "But you can never escape me, Clara." Clara's mind raced. What had happened? Had the curse never truly been broken? Had she only delayed the inevitable? The Nutcracker's wooden limbs cracked and splintered as it advanced, its grotesque smile never faltering. It was more terrifying than ever, its power growing with every movement. Clara couldn't understand it. She had faced the darkness, broken the chains, and now, here it was again, more menacing than before. As she backed away, she caught sight of the faint reflection of herself in the tall mirrors lining the theater walls. There was something in her eyes, a flicker of light, a spark of defiance, but also something else, something darker, lurking beneath the surface. For the briefest of moments, she saw it, a shadow, a whisper of the nightmare that had once consumed her. Was the Nutcracker still inside her? No. Clara's breath steadied. She would not let fear control her again. She had already faced the darkness, stared it down, and she would do it again. With a deep breath, she turned back to the Nutcracker, her fists clenched, her mind determined. "This ends now," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. The Nutcracker halted, its crooked head tilting in confusion as if unsure of what to make of her newfound resolve. Clara stepped forward. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice growing louder with each word. The Nutcracker's smile faltered, its eerie eyes flickering as if unsure of how to react to her strength. And in that moment, Clara realized the truth. She had power over this nightmare. The Nutcracker could only exist as long as she feared it. And Clara was no longer afraid. With one final, steady step, she moved forward, her gaze never leaving the Nutcracker. And as she stepped closer, the Nutcracker began to crumble, its wooden body splintering, cracking apart, until it was nothing but pieces, fallen to the stage like forgotten toys. The theater fell silent again. Clara stood tall, breathing deeply as the last remnants of fear vanished into the air. She had conquered the darkness, and now she was free. Clara stood in the quiet aftermath, her heart still racing, but now calm, her breath steady. The theater felt different, lighter, as if the weight of the darkness had been lifted, leaving the air clean and free of its oppressive grip. The pieces of the Nutcracker lay scattered across the stage, once again just bits of carved wood, lifeless and empty. There was no sign of the curse that had once held her captive, no shadow lurking in the corners of the grand hall. For the first time, Clara felt truly alone, and yet, in that solitude, there was a sense of peace. She slowly took a step forward, her gaze falling on the crumpled remains of the Nutcracker, now just a broken relic of a forgotten dream. Her fingers brushed the edge of one of its splintered limbs, a reminder of the nightmare she had endured, the battle she had fought. But now it was over. The theater around her seemed to exhale, as if it too had been holding its breath, waiting for this moment of release. Clara smiled softly to herself. She had done it. She had found the strength to face her fears, to fight her way through the darkness. And now she was free to choose her own path. The silence stretched out, and as Clara turned to leave the stage, she felt the first true warmth of the morning sun on her skin, flooding through the open windows. The world outside awaited her, bright, clear, and full of endless possibilities. And for the first time in a long while, Clara didn't feel afraid. She was ready for whatever came next. The theater, once a place of mystery and fear, now stood as a symbol of her triumph. It was her world now, and she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the power to overcome them. With one last glance at the Nutcracker's remnants, Clara stepped into the light, leaving behind the darkness forever. The journey had ended, but a new chapter was just beginning. Clara stepped out of the theater, the soft golden light of morning wrapping around her like a warm embrace. The streets of New York City were alive, bustling with the sound of footsteps, distant conversations, and the hum of the early hours. But for Clara, everything seemed different now. The city, once overwhelming and filled with a sense of disconnection, now felt familiar, full of life, full of stories, full of new beginnings. Her footsteps were lighter as she walked, her mind clearer, free from the shadow that had clung to her for so long. The cold winter air kissed her cheeks, but it didn't bite anymore. It was as if the whole world had transformed, just as she had. The Nutcracker's dark influence, its grip on her heart, had disappeared, leaving only a sense of peace in its wake. Clara found herself standing at the edge of Central Park, gazing at the snow-covered trees, the delicate frost on the branches glittering like tiny diamonds in the morning light. She felt the quiet joy of a fresh start, a new chapter opening before her. Her mind flashed briefly to the theater, to the broken pieces of the Nutcracker, but she knew now that the real magic was never in the toy. The magic had always been within her. With each breath, she could feel the truth settle deep in her bones. She was no longer the girl who feared the darkness. She was someone who had faced it, who had found the strength to overcome it. And in that moment, Clara knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, she had the power to face them with courage and resilience. She could create her own